بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. صاحب السمو الشيخ محمد بن زايد آل نهيان، ولي عهد أبو ظبي، نائب قائد الأعلى للقوات المسلحة، سمو الشيوخ، أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، الضيوف الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. اسمحوا لي بداية بالتعريف عن نفسي. إبراهيم الخميري، إعلامي، ويشرفني اليوم أن أتولى مهمة إدارة هذا الحوار في هذا المجلس الكريم. الحضور الكرام، حوارنا لهذا اليوم مع البروفيسورة شيري توركل، أستاذة الدراسات الاجتماعية للعلوم والتكنولوجيا بمعهد ماساتشوستس للتكنولوجيا. كيف نستعيد المحادثة وجها لوجه في عصر منصات التواصل الاجتماعي؟ ونلفت لعنايتكم إلى أن المحاضرة ستكون باللغة الإنجليزية، وبإمكانكم استخدام السماعات للمتابعة الترجمة الفورية. وبعد الانتهاء سيتم فتح المجال لطرح الأسئلة التي يمكنكم كتابتها على النشرات الموجودة أمامكم. سمحوا لي الآن بأن أكمل حديثي باللغة الإنجليزية. Your Highnesses, Excellencies, Ladies and Gentlemen, we're pleased to have with us today Professor Sheri Tوركل, Professor of the Social Studies of Science and Technology at MIT. In this lecture today, Reclaiming Conversation, the Power of Face-to-Face Talk in the Age of Digital Media. Professor Sheri is an MIT professor who has spent the last 30 years studying the psychology of people's relationship with technology. She is also the founder and director of the MIT Initiative on Technology and Self. She has written 4 books on our relationship with digital culture. This includes the latest New York Times bestseller, Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk in the Age of Digital Media, which we will be delving in shortly. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sheri Tوركل.
Thank you so much. Highnesses, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm so happy to be here during your very special month, and I'm so happy to have been able to spend a few days here visiting your country with your so gracious hospitality, because it's given me an opportunity to travel a little and walk around a little and to visit your malls and to visit your parks and to have an opportunity to see families as I observe them in the United States, where children are tugging on their mothers' outfits, trying to get their mother's attention as their mothers are texting. And I've had the opportunity to watch families breaking the fast in the evening around a table at dinner, where couples are texting and not talking to each other, and families are again all texting and not looking up at each other. And I felt just like at home, and I thought, I am going to give a lecture that will be, if nothing else, pertinent to these people. So I'm very comfortable bringing my message to you and feeling that it is bringing a message that is right for the times in which you live, that you too are facing a culture where the seductive pull of digital technology is taking you away from face-to-face conversation, which essentially is what I've been studying as this technology has developed. And I'm here to talk to you about what its potential costs are in business, at home, in families, in education, and what we should do to start thinking about those costs, because I think those costs are real. So that's my topic today. Now, how did I get into this? I've been studying digital culture and connectivity since the earliest days of America Online, and my interest, since I'm a psychologist, has been in not so much how digital technology changes just what we do, but really who we are as people, what our relationships are like, both with other people, but also about ourselves as human beings, how we think about who we really are and what our identities are. And in doing this, I found 2 things. First of all, that we've really developed a new kind of psychology in being always connected. And it's a psychology that I call, I share, therefore I am. I share, therefore I am. And it means that things used to be that people had a thought and they said, I have a thought, I have a feeling, I want to make a call. In other words, people had an emotion and they wanted to share it. That was how it used to be. And now it's gone to, I want to have a feeling, I need to send a text, which is different. It goes from, I have a feeling, I want to make a call, from I want to have a feeling, I need to send a text. In other words, a generation has grown up that almost feels that it doesn't have the thought or the feeling or the emotion unless it's in the process of sharing it. And particularly for young people, that leaves them very vulnerable because they almost can't be alone without the phone and feel the full sense of who they are and what their feelings are. So that was the first thing. The second psychological, big psychological point, big psychological change with constant connectivity is a feeling that I called being alone together. And I wrote a book that I called Alone Together because this was so important. And alone together means that it's a new psychology where you are alone, but you're connected with everyone. And if you begin to feel guilty, if you feel isolated when you're alone, and people do start to feel isolated when they're alone, because they have so many connections. And again, among adolescents, this is associated with a new kind of depression. Because when adolescents who are essentially alone begin to feel isolated because they are physically isolated, they almost feel as though they don't have the right to these feelings because they're connected to everybody. They have hundreds and hundreds of friends on tap. And so this is something that we're learning more and more about is a new kind of depression in adolescence. I call it, again, a new kind of digital vulnerability that we really have to watch out for in adolescence that's part of the vulnerabilities of new digital culture. Another vulnerability I called FOMA, fear of missing out. Fear of missing out. Fear of missing out is that if you're online, you are presenting a curated self. So when I go online today, I surely will when I get back to my beautiful hotel, and I present what my day was like, I'm not going to present the difficulties I had in the gym doing my weights or my dehydration moment when I was rushing to get to water. No, I'll present this, quite frankly, my super glamorous moment. In other words, I will present a curated Sherry Turkle, and everybody else is doing the same thing. They don't present doing your dry cleaning, you present the kind of highlight, I have a better curated self today than most people, but people are presenting the curated self of their everyday life, and everybody is doing this. So everybody is looking out to see the curated self of everybody and feeling that everybody is living a better life than they are because they're only seeing other people as everybody presents their best self. And again, for grown-ups, we're kind of on to each other. For adolescents, this is a very, very vulnerable time of life when this can get kind of dangerous. People are continually comparing themselves to others, and people get depressed, trying to look perfect online. Sometimes in my research, I found that people don't only feel depressed vis-a-vis what others seem to be, they even feel envious of themselves. They even feel kind of alienated from the perfect self that they've presented and say, well, who is that Sherry Turkle? I kind of I'd like to be her. Who is she? They feel a sense of alienation from the very self that they've put online. We preach authenticity, but we practice self-curation, and that's kind of a problem. So there are so many vulnerabilities. Those were the basic ones, but in recent years, new vulnerabilities have been added to these that you read about every day in the newspaper and that have become very topical. And these are the new vulnerabilities that have come with the maturation of social media companies. So, for example, social media companies see what we're buying, see how we're feeling, and they sell to us at the moments when we are most vulnerable. That's the basic thing. It's like your selfhood is up for sale. We now find that if social media companies know that we're depressed, and it's very easy to tell if we're depressed because people actually type, "I'm depressed," or they have other markers of being depressed. Social media companies will, for example, make sure that advertisers sell over-the-counter medications for depression, or have not over-the-counter medications, but actually psychopharmacological medication sold to you at those moments when you might be depressed. Or makeup, another thing that a lot of people buy when they're depressed. So you're marketed to at the moments when you know that you're depressed.
So, Professor, we have become a focus group for these companies.
We become, ourselves become continually a focus group for marketing. And in some ways you say, well, I mean, I've had so many conversations about this, and people say, well, that's marketing, that's capitalism, kind of no harm, you're signing up for that. It knows you want shoes, it gives you the shoes it knows you want. But there is a kind of dark side. For example, Facebook ran an experiment where it showed people it showed some people that their friends had voted, and those people tended to vote. If it didn't show you that your friends had voted, you were less likely to vote.
Peer pressure.
Peer pressure. Turns out that if you're told that your friends had voted, you're more likely to vote. Now, that's great, but then the question arises, what kind of control is it now appropriate to have over a company like Facebook that can essentially manipulate an election? We have to be pretty sure that Facebook either tells everybody that their friends have voted or distributes that knowledge in a way that's fair. Right now, Facebook is just out there as a company that's not regulated at all by any kind of political regulation. So the enormous power for behavioral change, I mean, that is a very powerful thing, to be able to tell, to get people to vote by telling them that their friends have voted or not, is something that, really the polity as a whole has to be thinking about. So a lot of questions like that come up that need to be discussed. So, and I hope we talk about that more in the question period. At the end of this Alone Together project, which I worked on for 15 years, from the birth of social media until the maturation of Facebook, I realized that there was a question that I hadn't studied in all of these questions that I've just laid out. And the issue was this, that in my data, a phrase had come up over and over and over again. And that phrase was, and I really hadn't sort of looked at in depth, and that phrase was, I would rather text than talk. I would rather text than talk. And it came up in a variety of ways. It really wasn't always about texting. When people used that phrase, I would rather text than talk, what they were really trying to express is that they wanted to feel less vulnerable in their communications. They wanted to somehow stay behind their screen and feel less vulnerable in their communications. Now, they wanted to edit how they presented themselves. So they were talking about texting, but they were also talking about emailing a colleague at work rather than tapping them on the shoulder and going into their cubicle and saying something to them face to face. They were talking about family fights on GChat rather than having a discussion around a dining room table. They were talking about courtship on Facebook or GChat rather than actually having a conversation face to face. They were talking about finding all kinds of ways around conversation. And I called it a flight from conversation, and I pivoted for my Alone Together study to really study that question of what was this flight from conversation? What were people fleeing from, and what did they think they would get in business, in personal life, in education, in intimate life, family life, in this flight from conversation?
Professor Sheri, I
Yes.
just have a question.
Sure.
In regards to vulnerability to these utilities that we use
Yes.
in the 21st century, how can we encompass that to our usage, to our day-to-day, instead of having a normal conversation on GChat or on
Yeah.
Google? Where can we have, how can we take that offline with us?
Well, my argument is that we have to, when we start to have a family conversation on GChat, instead of saying, oh, this is so relaxing, I'm not needing to face my mother, this is so relaxing, I'm able to kind of get out my feelings and vent without really needing to deal with her. You have to say, I'm not seeing the look in her eye as I'm talking to her. This isn't a relationship. The highest value here is not venting. The highest value here is having a relationship with my mother. I better call her and make time to have a coffee. So what I'm arguing basically is that what feels good to us increasingly is hiding behind our screens because it feels more relaxing. I mean, you know, I'm being told that by the hundreds and hundreds of people I interview about this, but that something is always lost in business, in family life, and so we have to get ourselves into the habit of saying, okay, I know why I'm doing this, but what am I losing in the relationship? And the way I think about it now is that we're turning relationships into transactions. And when you turn a relationship into a transaction, you gain the feeling of relaxation that comes from a transaction, but you lose much of the value that you get from a relationship. And we have to remember the value, you know, where we really want to keep those relationships. So I'm pitching the importance of face-to-face relationships. So because I'm trained as I'm trained first as a developmental psychologist, and I know the work that face-to-face conversation does. It's where intimacy grows, it's where empathy develops. At work, conversation is where you develop productivity, work engagement, clarity, and collaboration. Study after study in the workplace shows that conversation is good for the bottom line. So I turned my attention to studying conversation, and I've been studying it now for 7 years, and of course we still talk, but people find ways around a certain kind of conversation that I want to draw your attention to. It's not as though I'm arguing a silent world. And the kind of conversation that we're losing is the kind that is open-ended, where we make ourselves vulnerable. So I studied companies where in meetings, people greet each other warmly, have, you know, bite to eat. They take their sweets or their muffin or their coffee and they sit down. But then they open up their laptop or their tablet and they start to do their email as the meeting goes on. And a good leader in that kind of meeting is one who knows when to tell somebody to shut down their email about 5 minutes before that person needs to make a contribution in the meeting. So I call those kind of meetings that are not quite meetings. Not everybody is paying as much attention as they should, and yet those meetings persist. And yet, even with all of this, I am very hopeful. Now, why am I hopeful? I'm hopeful because I think that we are at a turning point. A recent study showed that 89% of Americans took out their phones during their last social encounter, and 82% And the reason they took it out was to look up a train schedule or to show somebody a picture. I mean, they didn't take out their phone to say, I want to break up this conversation, I'm going to take out my phone and really shut it down. They took it out for all the reasons we take out our phones. But 82% said that it deteriorated the social interaction that they were in. So that means that 89% of Americans are doing something with their phones that 82% of those people think is deteriorating their relationship. So I think that we're at this turning point, and I think this intuition is correct, because studies show that, in fact, there is a deterioration of kind of empathic connection when you have your phone out. So there's a classic study that I hope doesn't embarrass too many of you, because this may be your regular practice, that if we were together having lunch and there was a cell phone on the table, turned off and turned face down, the very presence of that phone would do two things. The first thing it would do is it would make our conversation turn to more trivial topics. And the second thing it would do is that we would feel during lunch less of a kind of empathic connection with each other. When I first heard of this study, which is so simple to do and so simple to replicate, I really encourage you to do it. You know, this kind of thing, you can replicate this at home. I was stunned by how dramatic it is. And so it's kind of such a simple to do, such a simple take home in your families, in a business meeting, in a conversation with a colleague, is not to not bring your phone. We all want our phones with us. But when you are having lunch with your children, just hide the phone. It's really that simple. Or in my case, when I meet with my students for a meeting, is just to hide the phone. The conversation deepens and you feel more of a connection with the people you're with. Because for the generation that has grown up with phones on the table all the time, the drop in empathy, in all the ways we know how to study empathy, which admittedly are very primitive, just by asking, you know, can you identify with the people in this story, is the only way we know right now how to measure empathy, is dramatic. One study that reviewed research on empathy over a span of 30 years, from 79 to 2009, showed a 40% decline in empathy over those 30 years. But we don't just pay a price in empathic capacity. We pay a price in the capacity for solitude. And here's really where I want to end, and where I want to really focus your attention as we open the conversation out to my to-do list for you. There are very well-known experiments in the United States that are a little bit shocking, that's a pun, that are about the capacity for solitude. And essentially they ask college students to sit without a phone and without a book for 15 minutes, and they ask the college students, can you do this? For money. And the college students say, yes, for money. I will do that. And then you say to them, because it's a primed experiment, well, how would you feel about having an electroshock machine in the room? Would you think you'd want to give yourself electroshocks in that situation? The college students say, absolutely not. That's terrible. Of course not. And you say, okay, no pressure. And you put the college students in a chair, no phone, no books, but with a handy electroshock machine right next to them. And after 6 minutes, college students are giving themselves, experimenting with mild electroshocks, rather than sit quietly with their own thoughts.
So in some way they have symptoms of FOMO.
Yeah, well, they have symptoms of not being able to sit quietly with their own thoughts. Now, why am I stressing solitude in this talk about cell phones? Why is solitude so important? Because you need the capacity, and this is my pitch, You need the capacity for solitude in order to develop the capacity for conversation and mutuality. Solitude is the ground for real attachments to other people, because if you can't be with yourself, you can't turn to another person and really hear who they are, because you're so busy projecting on them who you need them to be in order to buttress your own sense of fragility of yourself. There's a great saying that if you can't teach your children to be alone, they'll only know how to be lonely. If you can't teach your children to be alone, they'll only know how to be lonely. And I think it's very, very wise. So I'm not anti-technology, I'm pro-conversation. I'm pro-conversation. And I relate to all kinds of stories I hear in business where people in business, young people in business don't want to come to meet their mentors. They just want to talk to their mentors on screens or by electronic mail, because my own students, who I beg to come to office hours, tell me that they would rather send me a perfect email and get a perfect email back. Now, anyone here knows that that is not how learning happens. It's not that you send somebody something perfect and got something perfect back. It's that you send something, you brought to a mentor something imperfect, and you were told, this isn't right yet, but I'll be here again for you next week. Come again, together we'll look at this again, together again, together again. Those are the magic words for mentorship, together again. So that's the problem, because so many of my students are trained from the earliest ages to measure themselves against a standard of perfection instead of understanding the perfection of imperfection, which is what technology is starting to teach them. And one young man said to me, conversation, I'll tell you what's wrong with conversation. It takes place in real time, and you can't control what you're going to say. And for me, this quote brings it all together. The fear of real time, the fear of imperfection, the pull of the edited life, the relief that comes that if you just could stay behind your screen, it would all be fine. And finally, I met with the researcher who found that empathy gap, the one that showed that in the past 30 years, young people's scores on the standard ways we know how to measure empathy had dropped 40%. And when I met with her, and this is so striking, she said to me that she'd been very depressed by her findings, as you would be too, and that what she had done is that she had turned her attention to writing empathy apps for the iPhone. Little games you could play on the iPhone that would increase your scores on these tests. And my argument here is that we are the empathy app. People are the empathy app. So what I am pitching here is that for the failing connections of our digital world, conversation is the talking cure. So what are the first steps? Because I promised some first steps very quickly. First, be media literate. Only now are some of the social media practices that I discussed before becoming widely known. Make them more widely known. This is what media literacy is about today. That we use our data to manipulate us into buying things, that companies make our phones more addicting than they need to be, the proliferation of fake news. All of this should be taught in our schools. That's what computer literacy is about. Create sacred spaces in your homes, in your schools, in your places of worship, the kitchen, the bedroom, the car, religious institutions, the classrooms, device-free places that are for conversations. And you can be a model. Give yourself permission to respond to emails by saying, I'm thinking. I'm thinking. Watch that go viral. We all need to do more thinking and less responding to email. And finally, obey what one of the students I interviewed, and all those hundreds of students, there was one I interviewed who talked about the 7-minute rule. Obey the 7-minute rule. The 7-minute rule says that it takes at least 7 minutes to see how a conversation is going to unfold. You have to let it unfold and see how it goes and not go to your phone before those minutes passes. If there is a lull in the conversation, let it be. Don't go to your phone. It's because it's when we are silent and stumble and search for our thoughts and let ourselves be human that we become most ourselves. And this is, after all, our goal, which is to let technology let us be most ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Sheri. Now we will start with the question and answer session. And until we receive questions from the audience, I have a couple of interesting questions that I want to ask you. Have we become digitally adept and in the process become socially impaired in a social setting?
Well, what I worry about most is that if you lose the capacity, if you lose fluency in face-to-face conversation, because it makes you tense, because you'd rather be perfect behind a screen and seem less vulnerable, you're closing yourself down to many of the things that will make you most successful in life. So I don't think there's a
disconnect.
I don't think there's a simple yes/no, but I think that the more you're afraid to be yourself, and the more you say, you know, I can make this easier for myself if I do this behind a screen, the less practice you're going to get in
real life.
In that being vulnerable is not such a terrible thing. And I worry so much about my students. I mean, I of course have the best students who have nothing to fear, and yet fear they need to be perfect and would rather be behind a screen.
That's very interesting, because you talked about empathy, and we have learned a new way of transcribing empathy from emojis, texts, curated content. Have we become, or have we developed in a digital state of empathy?
Well, a lot of people say, look, I express myself through my emojis, I express myself through my memes, I get plenty of my emotions out digitally. I don't feel constrained. And I want to honor that emojis and memes and things you can do digitally can express a great deal of emotion. But careful, it's not the same as watching a face and reading a face. And also, when you send out an emoji, you're saying, what do I want people to see me as reacting? How do I want to seem as though I'm reacting? So I have a 26-year-old daughter, and when she sends me something that upsets me, first I can be upset, and then I can say, okay, Professor Sheri, you don't want her to know you're upset. Why don't you send her an adorable emoji that will show her that you have a sense of humor? Because it's better for it will be better if she sees you that way. So I have that ability to say, okay, she won't see the real reaction, she'll see the better me. Now, sometimes it's better for us to show each other our better, you know, processed selves. But if we do that all the time, and that was kind of my final point, we're starting to do that, the balance starts to tip, and we're always starting to show each other that curated self. And if I showed my daughter all the time that curated mom, she would never get to know her vulnerable mom, who she needs to learn to know too. That's my point.
So bringing the conversation back to real time, and
Yeah.
since our conversation is about social media and how powerful it is as a tool, I want to bring to your attention something that has happened in the last 4 years and 5 years, that this boom of cyber wars that catapulted into actual wars between nations, between individuals, between a lot of individuals that are in the industry and in society. Where are you in terms of social media being utilized as a utility for peace or a utility for destruction?
Well, there's so many levels to this question. First of all, cyber war in certain ways starts in grade school, where there's a tremendous desensitization of kids about how much you're allowed to hurt somebody online. I have stories. I know you were gracious enough to buy a lot of copies of Reclaiming Conversation. I encourage you to read the chapters on kids, where there are stories of the cruelty of children to each other. And I ask them, why are you being cruel? You know, like I go in and I interview them, and why are you being cruel to each other? Like, what is with this? And they say, it's only the internet. It's only the internet. As though somehow the fact that this cruelty is happening on the internet is like, it's a reason. So, you know, great philosophers have told us that it is the face that creates us as human for each other. So I think that at a first level, we create the possibility for a kind of alienation that allows for great violence when we remove the face from each other. So I just want to say that on a deeply personal level, cyber war begins with the alienation of selves who are online being cruel to each other as cyber bullies. Now, obviously, we're at a point where we can use video games, and we do use video games, both to recruit for terrorist organizations and to train the military in how to be at war, both cyber war and other kinds of war. So we are at that place.
We're heading into that direction.
We're not heading. We are at that place. And then the question is, what are the appropriate checks on how we handle our children, so that our children, in my view, don't enter that world at 5 years old.
Okay.
That they have some time for childhood before they, where when they enter a world of video game violence, they have some understanding that there's real, that there is a relationship between video game violence and real life.
And in this last question,
but that is key, because children who don't have enough experience in the real can get a kind of lost in space. Well, they can lose touch with the fact that video game violence does relate back
suspension of disbelief,
to the actual harm of real people, and I think that's a great concern of just kind of putting people in virtual worlds and saying go. I mean, I think of this because last summer was a summer when Pokemon Go. I don't know if all you know this game, Pokemon Go, where it was a kind of game where you searched after virtual creatures, but the virtual creatures showed up on your real lawn. I don't know if you had it here, but we had it in Provincetown, Massachusetts. And my lawn was a Pokemon Go gymnasium. So which meant that Pokemon Go creatures played, that's where the best ones,
it was the biggest game of 2016.
Right, but they all tended, through no fault of mine, to congregate on my lawn, which meant that every kid in town came to my lawn and was like hitting things and stuff. Well, the point is that when I would say to these children who were destroying my hydrangea bushes, stop.
Find Pokemons.
Right, they were saying, but I'm just hitting the Pokemons.
Yeah, and in that regard, what are the tips, and this is a question from the audience, what are the tips to raise our kids without getting into that trap of social media? In a short answer, please.
What are the tips?
What are the tips to raise our kids without getting into that trap of social media abyss?
Well, I think that the thing you want to say to kids is not, I feel very strongly that everything about time online should not be in terms of time or hours. It should be in terms of spaces and places. So, not in the kitchen, not in the dining room, never around meal preparation, never when you're having a meal together or family time, never in the car. In other words, never at times when there's a kind of social life of the family, never in bed, never in the bedroom is very important. So, and I do think that the car is kind of ground zero for family life and child life in the digital age. So once you have these times that really are the times when children and families and parents can be together, you've created a life with your family where if there's play in addition to that, let them be children of their generation.
Thank you, Professor Sheri.
My pleasure.
أستأذنك سيدي في اختتام هذه الجلسة. Lastly, I'd like to thank His Highness for hosting these enlightening sessions, and I'd also like to thank Professor Sheri for her time and presentation, and the audience for their kind attention. To conclude this insightful conversation and lecture, as you said, Professor Sheri, we are not anti-technology, we are pro-conversation. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.